The possibility of an American invasion of Cuba may sound like Cold War fiction, but recent developments suggest this is no longer a scenario that can simply be dismissed. A CNN report released just days ago revealed unusually heavy US military aerial activity off the Cuban coast. According to the report, since February 4th, at least 25 flights involving both the US Air Force and the US Navy have operated over the region. The aircraft involved included both manned surveillance planes and unmanned drones. Now, military reconnaissance flights are not unusual by themselves. But what makes this situation particularly interesting is this. According to CNN, all these flights were visible on the Flight Radar 24 app. That matters because military aircraft can easily switch off their transponders and disappear from civilian tracking systems altogether. But in this case, they didn't. And that changes the entire meaning of the operation. This was not simply intelligence gathering. It was signaling. A message directed not just to Havana, but also at Moscow and Beijing. And as intended, the world noticed. Brazilian President Lula da Silva later claimed that President Donald Trump assured him that the United States has no intention of invading Cuba. But listen carefully to how Lula described that conversation.
If Trump needs help to discuss Cuba's situation, I am completely at his disposal. Because I heard if the translator is right that he said he is not thinking of invading Cuba. That was said by the interpreter.
This is an extraordinarily cautious statement. It leaves behind a great deal of diplomatic ambiguity. The kind diplomats intentionally create when nobody wants to fully commit to a position publicly. Now, to be clear, the discussion is not about whether such an invasion would be justified. What we at GlobalHeadwinds .com are exploring is something else entirely. Could it happen? And our assessment is this. Even if a US invasion of Cuba is not imminent today, the possibility over the next 2 to 3 months is very real. There are 3 major reasons for that conclusion. First, Donald Trump himself. Trump, particularly in his second term, has shown a clear preference for projecting raw American military power. He openly relishes demonstration of force. And historically, leaders who strongly identify with military dominance often prefer confrontations where overwhelming superiority guarantees quick results. Cuba fits that profile perfectly. Second, Russia. Cuba's most important strategic ally is currently deeply consumed by war in Ukraine. Yes, Russia continues to pursue its battlefield objectives. But at the same time, Ukraine's increasingly effective drone warfare has forced Moscow into a highly defensive posture across multiple regions. The Kremlin simply may not have the bandwidth for another geopolitical confrontation in the Western Hemisphere. And third, China. President Xi Jinping is currently focused inward. His administration continues an aggressive anti-corruption purge inside the Chinese military establishment. At the same time, Beijing has historically avoided direct military confrontation with the United States whenever possible. That makes meaningful Chinese intervention in Cuba unlikely, at least for now. Of course, common sense would argue against an invasion. The United States is already heavily engaged in the Iranian conflict with multiple carrier battle groups deployed in the Gulf region and thousands of troops committed in the Middle East operations. On paper, opening another front would seem strategically reckless. But Cuba presents a very different military equation. Unlike distant wars in Middle East, Cuba sits only miles away from the American shores. The United States would not need a massive naval invasion force to establish the operational dominance. It already possesses a ready-made foothold in Guantanamo Bay in southeastern Cuba. From here, US Marines could rapidly establish a beachhead, while airborne divisions and air assault units enter northern Cuba under overwhelming air cover. Against the sheer scale of American air power, Cuban defenses could be neutralized extremely quickly. And that is precisely what makes this scenario dangerous. Not because the operation would be difficult, but because it may appear too easy. And when military action looks easy, political leaders become far more willing to consider it, particularly ahead of elections. Trump has made little effort to hide his hostility towards the communist government in Havana. And he believes dismantling that regime before November congressional elections could revive Republican momentum. The political temptation becomes enormous. For now, this remains speculation. But the signals coming out of Washington are becoming harder to ignore. The flights, the messaging, the ambiguity, the timing, all of it points towards a possibility the world has not seriously contemplated in decades: the return of a major US military intervention in Cuba. Whether this ultimately becomes another Cold War standoff or erupts into a full-scale conflict, only time will tell.